Sometimes a single moment of compassion can change the course of history forever. In the rugged wilderness of 1880s Montana, where tensions between settlers and Native American tribes ran as deep as the mountain canyons, one man's decision to offer water to a stranger would challenge everything both communities believed about each other. This is not just a story about kindness. It's about how one act of humanity can bridge the deepest divides and create bonds that last for generations. What happened next would become legend, passed down through both ranching families and tribal councils, proving that sometimes the most powerful weapon against hatred is simply treating another human being as exactly that, human. The story begins with Thomas McKenna, a weathered rancher who believed that survival in the harsh frontier meant trusting no one. But on one scorching summer day, when he encountered a wounded Native American warrior dying of thirst on his land, everything he thought he knew about enemies and allies was about to change forever. Thomas McKenna wiped the sweat from his weathered brow as he guided his horse along the rocky trail that wound through his vast ranch in the Montana Territory. The summer of 1883 had been particularly brutal, with temperatures soaring well above anything the old-timers could remember. The grass had turned brown weeks ago, and even the hardiest cattle were struggling to find enough water to survive. Thomas had spent the better part of the morning checking on his water sources, making sure the precious liquid was still flowing from the natural springs that dotted his property. At 52 years old, Thomas had lived through more than his share of hardships. He had arrived in Montana 15 years earlier with nothing but a determination to build something lasting for his family. His wife, Sarah, had died 3 winters ago from pneumonia, leaving him alone to manage the ranch with just the help of 2 hired hands, Miguel and Pete. The isolation had hardened him, but it had also taught him the value of every drop of water, every blade of grass, and every moment of peace. The tension between the white settlers and the local Native American tribes had been escalating for months. Just 2 weeks prior, a neighboring ranch had reported stolen cattle, and the blame had immediately fallen on the Crow tribe that inhabited the lands to the north. Thomas had his own opinions about such accusations, having lived long enough to know that desperation could drive any man to take what he needed to survive, regardless of the color of his skin. As his horse crested a small hill, Thomas noticed something unusual near the base of a large boulder about 100 yards ahead. At first, he thought it might be a fallen tree branch or perhaps a dead animal, but as he drew closer, the shape began to take on a more human form. His hand instinctively moved to the rifle secured to his saddle, a habit born from years of frontier living where danger could appear without warning. The figure was indeed human, and as Thomas approached cautiously, he could see it was a Native American man, probably in his 30s, lying motionless against the rock. The man's dark hair was matted with dried blood, and his buckskin clothing was torn and stained. His lips were cracked and bleeding, clear signs of severe dehydration. Most concerning of all, Thomas could see a crude bandage wrapped around the man's left thigh, soaked through with blood that had long since dried black in the intense heat. Thomas dismounted his horse slowly, keeping his rifle within easy reach, but not drawn. The man appeared to be unconscious, possibly near death. In the harsh code of the frontier, many would have simply ridden away, unwilling to risk involvement with what could be a dangerous situation. Relations between settlers and tribes were strained enough without adding complications like this. But as Thomas stood looking down at the dying man, he felt something stir within him that he had not experienced in a long time. Perhaps it was the memory of his own desperate moments when he had first arrived in Montana, or maybe it was the simple recognition that this was another human being in desperate need of help. Whatever the reason, Thomas found himself kneeling beside the unconscious warrior, checking for signs of life. The man's chest rose and fell in shallow, irregular breaths. His skin was burning hot to the touch, and Thomas could see that without immediate help, this stranger would not live to see another sunrise. The wound on his leg appeared to be several days old, probably from a gunshot, and infection was clearly setting in. But the most immediate concern was dehydration. In this heat, a man could die from lack of water in just a few hours. Thomas looked around the desolate landscape, weighing his options. His nearest neighbor was more than 10 miles away, and the man clearly could not be moved in his current condition. The only source of water nearby was a small spring that bubbled up from the rocks about 50 yards away, a hidden oasis that Thomas had discovered years ago, and kept secret even from his own ranch hands. Making his decision, Thomas hurried to his horse and retrieved his water canteen. He also grabbed a clean cloth from his saddlebag, one that Sarah had embroidered years ago with small wildflowers. As he returned to the wounded man, Thomas gently lifted the stranger's head and placed the canteen to his cracked lips. The first few drops seemed to have no effect, but as Thomas persisted, the man's throat began to work automatically, swallowing the precious liquid. Gradually, the warrior's eyes fluttered open, dark brown and filled with pain and confusion. When he saw Thomas leaning over him, the man tried to pull away, his hand reaching weakly for what appeared to be an empty knife sheath at his belt. Thomas held up his hands in a universal gesture of peace, continuing to offer water while speaking in the calm, steady voice he had once used to soothe spooked cattle. He had picked up a few words of the local tribal language over the years through trading and occasional interactions, though his pronunciation was probably terrible. The wounded man studied Thomas's face intently, as if trying to determine whether this white rancher represented salvation or additional danger. Gradually, his resistance faded, and he allowed Thomas to help him drink more water. Color began to return to his ashen cheeks, and his breathing became more regular. Using a combination of hand gestures and the few tribal words he knew, Thomas tried to communicate his intentions. He pointed to the man's wounded leg, then to his horse, trying to indicate that he wanted to help. The warrior shook his head weakly, pointing in the direction of the northern hills and speaking in his native language with obvious urgency. Thomas understood enough to realize that the man was worried about something or someone in those hills. Perhaps his tribe was searching for him, or maybe there was some other danger approaching. Either way, it was clear that this man could not be left here to die, regardless of the potential complications. Over the next hour, Thomas worked methodically to stabilize his unexpected patient. He cleaned the infected wound as best he could with water and cloth, though he knew it needed proper medical attention that was beyond his frontier skills. He moved the man to a more shaded location and continued to provide water at regular intervals. The warrior's strength gradually improved enough for him to sit up against the boulder, though he remained very weak. As the afternoon wore on, the two men began to communicate more effectively through gestures and the few shared words they had in common. The warrior's name was something that sounded like Running Bear to Thomas's ears, though he knew he was probably butchering the pronunciation. Running Bear had been shot 3 days ago during what appeared to have been a hunting expedition gone wrong. He had been trying to make his way back to his people when exhaustion and blood loss had finally overcome him. Thomas learned that Running Bear was not just any tribal member, but someone of importance within his community. The elaborate beadwork on his clothing and the quality of his weapons suggested he held a position of respect, possibly as a hunting leader or warrior chief. This realization made Thomas even more nervous about the situation he had stumbled into. As the sun began its descent toward the western mountains, casting long shadows across the rugged landscape, both men heard it at the same time. The distant sound of horses approaching at a gallop. Running Bear's eyes widened with what appeared to be recognition rather than fear, and he struggled to sit up straighter against the boulder. Thomas felt his heart rate increase as he counted the approaching hoofbeats. There had to be at least a dozen horses, possibly more, and they were coming fast. He thought about his rifle, still secured to his saddle, and wondered if he had made a terrible mistake in stopping to help this stranger. Stories of white men being killed for far less than this were common around the frontier settlements. But as he looked at Running Bear, Thomas saw something unexpected in the warrior's expression. Instead of the grim satisfaction of a man whose rescue was at hand, there was concern, even worry. Running Bear was looking directly at Thomas, and in his dark eyes was what appeared to be genuine gratitude mixed with apprehension about what was about to happen. The sound of approaching horses grew louder, accompanied now by voices calling out in the tribal language. Running Bear answered weakly, his voice barely carrying across the rocks. But it was enough. The hoofbeats changed direction, heading directly toward their location. Thomas stood up slowly, his hands visible and away from any weapons. Whatever was about to happen, he had made his choice when he decided to offer water to a dying man. There was no point in regrets now. The first horse appeared around a cluster of large boulders, followed quickly by several others. The riders were all Native American warriors, their faces painted for what Thomas assumed had been a search party. They wore a mixture of traditional clothing and items acquired through trade, including several rifles that were now pointed in his direction. The lead rider, a man who appeared to be in his 40s with streaks of gray in his black hair, surveyed the scene quickly. His eyes moved from Thomas to Running Bear, taking in the makeshift bandages, the empty water canteen, and the obvious care that had been provided to the wounded warrior. Running Bear spoke rapidly in his native language, gesturing toward Thomas and then to the water canteen. The other warriors listened intently, their weapons gradually lowering as they heard the story of what had transpired. The leader dismounted and approached Running Bear, examining his condition while continuing to listen to the account of his rescue. Thomas stood motionless, understanding that his life quite literally hung in the balance of whatever Running Bear was telling his people about the events of the afternoon. The fact that the warriors had not immediately attacked was encouraging, but the situation remained extremely volatile. After what felt like an eternity, the tribal leader turned to face Thomas directly. The man's weathered features showed the wisdom and caution of someone who had lived through many conflicts, but there was also something else in his expression that Thomas could not quite identify. In carefully pronounced English, the leader spoke the first words that would begin to bridge two very different worlds. "You give water to my son when he was dying. This is a good thing you do." The simple statement hung in the air between them, carrying implications that neither man could fully understand at that moment. Thomas had acted out of basic human compassion, never imagining that his patient might be the son of what appeared to be a tribal chief. The ramifications of this chance encounter were about to ripple out in ways that would affect both communities for generations to come. As the sun continued its descent toward the horizon, painting the Montana sky in brilliant shades of orange and red, Thomas McKenna found himself standing at the center of a moment that would change everything he thought he knew about enemies, allies, and the simple power of treating another human being with dignity and respect. The story of the rancher who gave water to a dying warrior was just beginning, and its conclusion would become the stuff of legend throughout the entire territory. Chief Standing Wolf had lived through more than 60 winters, and in that time, he had learned to read men the way others read the changing seasons. As he stood before the white rancher who had saved his son's life, he saw something that surprised him. There was no arrogance in this man's bearing, no expectation of reward or recognition. The rancher simply stood quietly, his weathered hands hanging at his sides, waiting to see what would happen next. The other warriors remained mounted, their expressions ranging from curiosity to suspicion. Among them was Wolf's younger brother, Soaring Hawk, whose hatred for white settlers had only intensified after losing his wife and daughter in a raid by cavalry soldiers 2 years prior. Soaring Hawk's hand rested on the handle of his war club, and his dark eyes never left Thomas's face. Wolf knelt beside his son, examining the makeshift bandages and noting the careful way the wound had been cleaned. Running Bear was weak but coherent, and he continued to speak in their native language, providing details about how the white man had found him near death and worked tirelessly to save his life. The chief listened carefully, occasionally glancing up at Thomas with growing respect. Thomas found himself remembering stories he had heard around campfires and in saloons about encounters between settlers and tribes. Most of those tales ended in violence and death, with both sides viewing the other as savage enemies to be destroyed or driven away. Yet here he stood, surrounded by armed warriors who had every reason to consider him a threat, and instead of hostility, he sensed something entirely different in the air. As Running Bear finished his account, Chief Standing Wolf rose slowly to his feet. The other warriors dismounted at his signal, though they remained alert and ready for trouble. Wolf approached Thomas until they stood face to face, two men separated by culture and language, but united in this moment by a single act of compassion. The chief reached into a leather pouch hanging from his belt and withdrew an object that gleamed in the fading sunlight. It was a small medallion, intricately carved from what appeared to be silver, depicting an eagle in flight. Wolf held the medallion out toward Thomas, speaking in English that, while accented, was surprisingly clear and well-pronounced. "This belonged to my father and his father before him. It has protected our family through many battles and many seasons of hardship. I give it to you now because you have saved what is most precious to me in all the world. My son would be dead if not for your kindness." Thomas hesitated, understanding the significance of what was being offered. He had lived on the frontier long enough to know that such gifts were not given lightly, especially between peoples who were often at war. Accepting the medallion would create obligations and connections that could complicate his life in ways he could not predict. But as he looked into the chief's eyes, Thomas saw genuine gratitude and something that might have been hope. Slowly, he extended his hand and allowed Wolf to place the medallion in his palm. The metal was warm from being carried close to the chief's body, and the craftsmanship was extraordinary, far more sophisticated than anything Thomas had expected from what many settlers dismissively called primitive people. "I thank you for this honor," Thomas replied, his voice hoarse from the day's emotions. "But I did nothing more than any decent man should do. Your son was dying, and I happened to have water." Chief Standing Wolf smiled for the first time since arriving, and Thomas was struck by how the expression transformed the older man's stern features. "You had water, yes, but many men would have ridden past a dying enemy without stopping. You chose to see a human being in need rather than a threat to be avoided. This choice makes all the difference." The other warriors had been listening to this exchange with varying degrees of understanding, depending on their knowledge of English. Soaring Hawk stepped forward, his expression still hard with suspicion, and spoke rapidly to his brother in their native tongue. Wolf replied calmly, but firmly, and Thomas could sense that some kind of disagreement was taking place. Running Bear struggled to sit up straighter against the boulder and added his voice to the conversation. Though Thomas could not understand the words, the tone was clearly supportive of whatever position the chief was taking. After several minutes of discussion, Wolf raised his hand for silence and turned back to Thomas. "My brother believes I am making a mistake in showing trust to a white man. He has seen too much betrayal, too much broken faith from your people. But my son tells me you had every opportunity to take advantage of his weakness, to harm him or simply leave him to die, and instead you chose mercy. This tells me something important about who you are." Thomas nodded thoughtfully. "I understand your brother's caution. There have been wrongs committed on both sides, and trust is not easily given or earned. But perhaps that is exactly why small acts of decency matter so much. They remind us that we are all human beings first, before we are anything else." The wisdom in Thomas's words seemed to resonate with several of the warriors, even those who did not speak English. Body language and tone could communicate respect across any cultural barrier, and these men had lived long enough to recognize sincerity when they encountered it. Chief Standing Wolf made a decision that would echo through the years to come. "You have given life to my son. According to the ways of our people, this creates a bond between our families that cannot be broken by time or circumstance. You are now under the protection of our tribe, and we are bound to offer you aid if you should ever need it." The formal nature of the declaration was not lost on Thomas. He was being offered something unprecedented in the history of relations between settlers and the local tribes, a guarantee of safe passage and mutual assistance. Such agreements had been attempted before by government officials and military leaders, but they had inevitably failed due to misunderstandings, broken promises, and mutual distrust. As if reading his thoughts, Wolf continued, "I know such words have been spoken before and broken like dry branches in the wind. But this bond is different because it is born from action, not from talk around treaty tables. You risked your own safety to help my son, and this deed cannot be undone by politics or the fears of other men." The sun was now touching the western mountains, casting long purple shadows across the landscape. Chief Standing Wolf gestured to two of his warriors, who carefully lifted Running Bear and placed him on a travois that had been constructed while the adults talked. The wounded man was conscious and alert, but clearly needed proper medical care that could only be provided by the tribe's healers. Before departing, Wolf approached Thomas one final time. "There may come a day when you need friends, white man. When that day arrives, send word to our village, and help will come. This I promise by the spirit of my ancestors and the love I bear for my son." Thomas felt the weight of the silver medallion in his pocket, and the even greater weight of the responsibility that had just been placed upon his shoulders. "How will I send word if such a need arises?" Wolf smiled and pointed to a distinctive rock formation visible in the distance, two tall spires of red stone that stood like sentinels against the sky. "Leave a message tied with blue cloth at the base of the Twin Brothers. Our scouts pass that way regularly, and word will reach me within 2 days." The tribal leader mounted his horse with the fluid grace of a man who had spent his entire life in the saddle. The other warriors followed suit, forming a protective formation around the travois carrying Running Bear. As they prepared to depart, Wolf raised his hand in a gesture of farewell that somehow managed to convey both respect and genuine fondness. "Remember this day, Thomas McKenna," the chief called out, having somehow learned the rancher's name during their conversation. "Remember that enemies can become brothers when compassion bridges the distance between them." As the sound of hoofbeats faded into the evening air, Thomas found himself alone once again on his vast ranch. But something fundamental had changed in the past few hours. The isolation that had defined his life since Sarah's death no longer felt quite so absolute. He had made a connection with another human being that transcended the artificial boundaries created by race and culture. The ride back to his ranch house took nearly an hour, and Thomas used the time to process what had happened. He thought about the medal in his pocket, about the promise of protection from Chief Standing Wolf, and about the look of gratitude in Running Bear's eyes. Most of all, he thought about how easily he could have ridden past that boulder without stopping, allowing another human being to die alone and unmourned. When Thomas finally reached his small log cabin, he found Miguel and Pete sitting on the front porch, their faces creased with worry. They had expected him back hours ago, and his delayed return had sparked fears that he might have encountered trouble with rustlers or wild animals. "Boss, we were about to come looking for you," Miguel called out as Thomas dismounted near the barn. "Everything all right? You look like you've seen a ghost." Thomas considered how to explain the afternoon's events. Miguel and Pete were good men, but they shared the typical frontier prejudices against Native Americans. They would have trouble understanding why their boss had risked his life to help a wounded warrior, especially the son of a tribal chief. "I found a wounded man on the North Range," Thomas said simply, gave him some water, and stayed with him until help arrived. Nothing more than any Christian should do for a fellow human being. Pete's expression darkened with suspicion. "What kind of man? Not one of them Indians, I hope. You know they've been rustling cattle from the Henderson place." Thomas fixed his ranch hand with a steady stare that discouraged further questions. "A man in need, Pete. That's all that matters. Now let's get the horses fed and bedded down. Tomorrow we need to check the water levels in the south pasture." That night, Thomas sat on his porch long after Miguel and Pete had retired to the bunkhouse. He held the silver medallion up to the light of the oil lamp, studying the intricate carving of the eagle. The craftsmanship was extraordinary, rivaling anything he had seen produced by skilled silversmiths in San Francisco or Denver. As he examined the gift, Thomas realized that his understanding of the local tribes had been shaped almost entirely by secondhand stories and prejudicial assumptions. The men he had encountered today were not the savage warriors described in newspaper accounts and military reports. They were complex human beings with their own codes of honor, their own family bonds, and their own capacity for both gratitude and mercy. The evening air carried the sounds of coyotes calling to each other across the rangeland, a haunting melody that had once seemed lonely to Thomas, but now felt somehow more connected to the larger rhythm of life on the frontier. He thought about Chief Standing Wolf's words regarding the bond that had been created between their families, and wondered what that might mean for his future. Over the following weeks, Thomas found himself paying closer attention to news and gossip about the local tribes. He learned that Chief Standing Wolf was widely respected, even among white settlers, as a man of his word who had consistently honored agreements and avoided unnecessary conflict. The chief's band had never been implicated in any of the cattle rustling that had plagued the area, and several sources confirmed that Wolf actively discouraged his warriors from taking actions that might provoke retaliation against innocent members of either community. Thomas also discovered that Running Bear was indeed a figure of importance within the tribe, serving as one of the chief's primary advisors on matters related to hunting and territorial boundaries. His recovery from the infected gunshot wound became a topic of discussion in tribal councils, with the story of the white rancher's compassion being shared among both the young warriors and the tribal elders. As autumn arrived in Montana, with its crisp mornings and spectacular displays of changing leaves, Thomas began to notice subtle changes in his interactions with the wider community. Word had somehow spread about his encounter with the tribal search party, though the details had become confused and embellished in the retelling. Some settlers viewed his actions with suspicion, suggesting that he had somehow betrayed his own people by showing kindness to the enemy. Others were curious about the experience, asking probing questions about tribal customs and capabilities that Thomas was not qualified to answer. A few, particularly those who had lived on the frontier long enough to understand the value of peaceful coexistence, quietly expressed their approval of his humanitarian gesture. The changing seasons also brought new challenges to Thomas's ranch operation. The severe summer drought had taken a toll on his grasslands, and he was forced to move his cattle to higher elevations where water and forage were still available. This brought him into areas of his property that he had rarely visited, including regions that bordered on traditional tribal hunting grounds. It was during one of these reconnaissance trips that Thomas encountered his first real test of Chief Standing Wolf's promise of protection. He had been riding alone through a narrow canyon when he came upon a group of young warriors who appeared to be on some kind of training expedition. The young men, probably in their late teens or early 20s, were armed and painted for what looked like a mock battle exercise. When they spotted Thomas, the warriors immediately surrounded him, their horses dancing nervously as their riders spoke rapidly in their native language. Thomas recognized none of the faces, and it became clear that these young men had not been present during his encounter with Chief Standing Wolf several months earlier. One of the warriors, his face painted in bold stripes of red and black, rode close enough to Thomas that their horses were almost touching. The young man spoke in broken English, his tone hostile and challenging. "You white men have no business in sacred hunting ground. You turn back now or face consequences of trespass." Thomas remained calm, though his heart was beating rapidly. He slowly reached into his shirt pocket and withdrew the silver medallion that Chief Standing Wolf had given him. Holding it up so all the warriors could see it clearly, he spoke in the most respectful tone he could manage. "I am Thomas McKenna. Chief Standing Wolf gave me this token after I helped his son Running Bear. I mean no disrespect to your sacred places, but I'm under the protection of your chief." The effect of the medallion was immediate and dramatic. The young warriors fell silent, their expressions changing from hostility to amazement as they recognized the significance of what Thomas was showing them. The leader of the group dismounted and approached for a closer look at the medallion, his eyes wide with surprise. The young warrior who had challenged Thomas stepped back in obvious shock when he recognized the eagle medallion. He spoke rapidly to his companions in their native tongue, and Thomas could hear what sounded like astonishment and perhaps even fear in their voices. The warrior who had examined the medallion more closely returned it to Thomas with a gesture that bordered on reverence. "Forgive our words, friend of Standing Wolf," the young man said, his English suddenly much more respectful. "We did not know you carry the sacred eagle of our chief. You are welcome in these lands, and we offer our protection for your journey." Thomas tucked the medallion back into his shirt, relieved but also somewhat overwhelmed by the power that the simple piece of silver seemed to possess. "I appreciate your courtesy. I'm only checking on my cattle that have wandered into the higher country. I will not disturb any sacred sites or hunting areas." The leader of the young warriors, who introduced himself as Swift Arrow, insisted on providing an escort to ensure Thomas's safety. As they rode together through the canyon, Swift Arrow shared the story of how Thomas's rescue of Running Bear had become legendary within the tribe. The tale had been told and retold around evening fires, growing in significance with each telling. "The elders say it proves that not all white men have hearts of stone," Swift Arrow explained as they navigated a particularly rocky section of trail. "Some of our people believed your kind was incapable of mercy, especially toward our warriors. Your actions have given hope to those who still believe peace between our peoples might be possible." Thomas found himself deeply moved by this revelation. He had acted purely on instinct when he found Running Bear dying of thirst, never imagining that his simple gesture would carry such symbolic weight. The responsibility of representing the possibility of peace between two communities felt overwhelming for a man who had just wanted to save another human being's life. As autumn progressed into winter, Thomas began to notice other subtle changes in his daily routine. Occasionally, he would find small gifts left near his water sources, perfectly crafted arrowheads, bundles of medicinal herbs, or beautifully woven grass baskets. These tokens appeared without explanation, and Thomas understood them to be expressions of gratitude from tribal members who had heard the story of his kindness to Running Bear. The winter of 1883 was particularly harsh, with temperatures dropping far below normal and snow falling in amounts that tested the survival skills of both settlers and Native Americans. Thomas's cattle struggled to find sufficient forage, and he was forced to break into his emergency hay supplies much earlier than usual. It was during one of the worst blizzards of the season that Thomas truly understood the depth of Chief Standing Wolf's commitment to their bond. A violent storm had trapped him in his ranch house for 3 days, with snow piling up against the windows and winds howling like banshees across the rangeland. When the storm finally passed, Thomas discovered that 2 of his prize bulls had wandered away during the blizzard and were nowhere to be found. Miguel and Pete helped him search for the missing animals, but after 2 days of fruitless tracking through deep snow, they were forced to conclude that the bulls had either died in the storm or traveled too far to recover. The financial loss was significant, representing nearly a year's worth of breeding fees and the foundation of Thomas's plans for improving his herd. On the morning of the 3rd day after the storm, Thomas was startled by the sound of horses approaching his ranch house. Looking out his window, he saw a group of mounted tribal members leading his 2 missing bulls through the snow. Chief Standing Wolf himself was among the riders, along with Running Bear, who appeared to have made a complete recovery from his injuries. Thomas hurried outside to greet his unexpected visitors, amazed that they had ventured out in such dangerous weather conditions to return his lost cattle. Chief Standing Wolf dismounted and approached with the same dignity and warmth that had characterized their first meeting. "We found these animals wandering in the high country, nearly dead from cold and hunger," Wolf explained. "My people have been caring for them in sheltered caves until the weather allowed safe travel. Running Bear insisted we bring them to you personally, as a way of continuing the circle of kindness you began when you saved his life." Running Bear, who had been working to improve his English during his recovery, stepped forward with a broad smile. "You gave me water when I was dying. Now we give life back to your animals when they were dying. This is how friendship grows between different peoples." Thomas was overwhelmed by the gesture, understanding that the tribal members had risked their own safety to rescue and care for his livestock during one of the worst storms in recent memory. The bulls appeared to be in good health despite their ordeal, a testament to the quality of care they had received. "I cannot adequately express my gratitude," Thomas said, his voice thick with emotion. "You have saved not just my animals, but quite possibly my entire ranch operation. These bulls represent the future of my breeding program." Chief Standing Wolf waved away Thomas's thanks with characteristic modesty. "A promise given is a debt that must be paid. We told you that our tribe would offer aid when you needed it. The storm and the lost animals provided an opportunity to honor our word." As they shared hot coffee in Thomas's modest kitchen, the conversation turned to broader issues affecting both communities. Wolf expressed concern about increasing tensions between some of the younger tribal members and the growing number of settlers arriving in the territory. Recent incidents had raised fears on both sides, and the chief worried that a single spark might ignite a conflict that would destroy years of careful diplomacy. "There are those among my people who say the white man cannot be trusted, that all peaceful overtures are simply tricks to gain advantage," Wolf confided. "And I know there are settlers who view all of our warriors as threats to be eliminated. Your actions have provided proof that such thinking is false. But one example may not be enough to prevent larger troubles." Thomas nodded thoughtfully, having observed similar tensions in his own dealings with neighbors and townspeople. "Perhaps what we need are more examples, more opportunities for people from both sides to see each other as individuals rather than enemies." This conversation planted the seed of an idea that would grow into something unprecedented in the history of the Montana Territory. Over the following weeks, as winter gradually loosened its grip on the land, Thomas and Chief Standing Wolf began to develop a plan that would create opportunities for peaceful interaction between their communities. The plan was ambitious and potentially dangerous for both men. They proposed to organize a series of small gatherings where settlers and tribal members could meet under controlled circumstances to trade goods, share knowledge, and begin building the kind of personal relationships that might prevent larger conflicts. The first such gathering was planned for early spring, when travel would be easier and tensions might be reduced by the optimism that came with the changing season. Thomas agreed to host the meeting on his ranch, providing neutral ground that was familiar to both communities. Chief Standing Wolf would bring a small group of his most trusted advisors and warriors, while Thomas would invite neighboring ranchers who had shown openness to peaceful coexistence. Preparing for this unprecedented meeting required careful planning and considerable courage from all involved. Thomas faced criticism from some of his neighbors who viewed any cooperation with tribal members as treasonous to their own people. Several ranchers warned him that he was being naive about the true nature of savage peoples and that his misplaced trust would ultimately lead to disaster. Miguel and Pete expressed their own reservations about having tribal members visit the ranch, though their concerns were based more on fear of the unknown than on any specific hostility. Thomas spent considerable time explaining his vision for peaceful coexistence and assuring his employees that every precaution will be taken to ensure everyone's safety. Chief Standing Wolf faced even greater challenges within his own community. Soaring Hawk remained deeply suspicious of any cooperation with white settlers, and he had influential supporters among the younger warriors who had grown up during years of increasing conflict. The chief was forced to use all of his political skill and moral authority to convince his council that the potential benefits of peaceful dialogue outweighed the obvious risks. Running Bear proved to be his father's strongest ally in promoting the planned gathering. His personal experience with Thomas's compassion gave him credibility with tribal members who might otherwise have dismissed the idea as foolishly optimistic. He spoke passionately at council meetings about the possibility of finding common ground with settlers who shared his rescuer's sense of basic humanity. As spring arrived with its familiar promise of renewal and new beginnings, both men worked tirelessly to prepare for the historic meeting. Thomas repaired and expanded his modest guest facilities, while Wolf carefully selected the tribal representatives who would accompany him. Both leaders understood that the success or failure of this first gathering might determine whether future cooperation would be possible. The night before the scheduled meeting, Thomas sat on his porch watching the stars emerge in the clear mountain sky. He thought about the chain of events that had led to this moment, beginning with his decision to offer water to a dying stranger. At the time, it had seemed like the most natural thing in the world, requiring no more consideration than breathing or sleeping. Now, months later, that simple act of compassion had grown into something far larger and more significant than he could have imagined. The success of tomorrow's meeting might influence the future of relations between settlers and Native Americans throughout the territory. The thought was both inspiring and terrifying. Miguel approached from the direction of the barn, having finished his evening chores. The older man had gradually overcome his initial skepticism about the planned gathering, though he still harbored concerns about potential dangers. "You sure about this, boss?" Miguel asked as he settled into a chair beside Thomas. "There's still time to call it off if you're having second thoughts. Nobody would think less of you for being cautious." Thomas considered the question seriously before answering. "I'm not sure about anything, Miguel, but I'm certain that continuing down the path of mutual fear and suspicion will lead to nothing but more bloodshed and suffering. This might be our only chance to try something different." As they talked quietly in the gathering darkness, both men could hear the distant howling of wolves echoing across the rangeland. The sound had once seemed ominous to Thomas, a reminder of the wild and potentially dangerous nature of frontier life. Tonight, it seemed more like a song of hope, a call for all creatures to find their place in the larger harmony of existence. Dawn would bring Chief Standing Wolf and his delegation to the ranch, marking the beginning of an experiment in peaceful coexistence that would test the courage and vision of everyone involved. Thomas felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders like a familiar burden, but it was a weight he was prepared to carry for the chance to prove that compassion could indeed bridge the deepest divides between different peoples. The morning of the gathering dawned clear and cool, with a gentle breeze carrying the scent of wildflowers across the rangeland. Thomas rose early to make final preparations, his stomach churning with a mixture of excitement and anxiety. Everything had been planned as carefully as possible, but there were so many variables beyond anyone's control that success was far from guaranteed. At precisely 10 o'clock, the sound of approaching horses announced the arrival of Chief Standing Wolf's delegation. Thomas walked out to greet them, followed by Miguel and Pete, who had volunteered to stay despite their reservations. The sight that met them was both impressive and somehow reassuring. Wolf rode at the head of a group of 6 tribal members, including Running Bear and 2 older men who Thomas assumed were respected elders. They were dressed in their finest clothing, but they had deliberately chosen garments that emphasized beauty and craftsmanship rather than martial prowess. Their weapons were minimal and obviously ceremonial rather than functional. "Welcome to my home," Thomas called out as the riders approached. "I'm honored by your presence and grateful for your courage in coming here." Chief Standing Wolf dismounted with his characteristic dignity and approached Thomas with a smile that seemed to ease some of the tension in the air. "The honor is ours, my friend. This day marks a new beginning for our peoples, and we are proud to be part of writing this chapter of history." As the morning progressed, the carefully planned gathering began to unfold according to the vision that both leaders had shared. The visiting tribal members demonstrated their skills at horse training, beadwork, and traditional crafts, while Thomas and his neighbors shared knowledge about cattle ranching, crop cultivation, and frontier survival techniques. Most importantly, the two groups began to see each other as individual human beings with families, hopes, fears, and dreams that transcended the artificial boundaries of race and culture. Children from both communities played together with the universal language of laughter and imagination, while their parents discovered common ground in their shared challenges of surviving and prospering in the harsh but beautiful landscape of the American West. The success of this first gathering would lead to many others, gradually building a network of personal relationships that would serve as a foundation for lasting peace between the settler and Native American communities. But the true significance of that spring day lay not in its immediate results, but in its demonstration that the simple act of treating another human being with dignity and respect could indeed change the course of history. The success of the first gathering on Thomas's ranch created ripples throughout the Montana Territory that neither he nor Chief Standing Wolf had anticipated. Word spread quickly among both settler and tribal communities about the unprecedented meeting where traditional enemies had shared food, exchanged knowledge, and discovered their common humanity. The reactions were as varied as they were passionate. Among the more progressive settlers, there was cautious optimism about the possibility of establishing lasting peace with the local tribes. Families who had lived in constant fear of raids and conflicts began to whisper about the hope of a future where their children might grow up without the shadow of violence hanging over their daily lives. Some ranchers, particularly those who had suffered losses due to the ongoing tensions, expressed genuine interest in exploring peaceful alternatives to the cycle of retaliation that had characterized frontier life for decades. However, the gathering also provoked intense opposition from those who viewed any cooperation with Native Americans as betrayal of their own people. A group of hardline settlers, led by a man named Silas Blackwood who had lost family members in a tribal raid 5 years earlier, began organizing what they called protection committees designed to prevent any further fraternization with the enemy. Blackwood was a powerful figure in the territorial capital, with connections to military officials and territorial government administrators. He used his influence to spread the message that Thomas McKenna had been deceived by clever savages who were using his naive goodwill as cover for planning larger attacks against defenseless settlements. The pressure on Thomas intensified when several of his neighbors began refusing to do business with him, claiming that his association with Chief Standing Wolf made him unreliable and potentially dangerous. Miguel and Pete found themselves subjected to suspicious questioning whenever they visited town for supplies, and rumors began circulating that the McKenna Ranch had become a staging area for tribal war parties. Similar challenges confronted Chief Standing Wolf within his own community. Soaring Hawk, the chief's brother who had never supported the peace initiative, used the mixed reactions from the settler community as evidence that white men could never be trusted to honor their commitments. He argued that the settlers' hostile responses proved they were merely seeking to gain intelligence about tribal capabilities while planning future attacks. A faction of younger warriors began to rally around Soaring Hawk's position, arguing that their chief had been made foolish by his gratitude to one white man. They pointed to the increasing harassment of tribal hunting parties by territorial militia units as proof that the peace initiative had actually made their situation worse rather than better. The tension reached a critical point in late summer when a confrontation between a tribal hunting party and a group of territorial soldiers resulted in the death of a young warrior named Gray Wolf, who happened to be Soaring Hawk's nephew. The incident occurred near the boundary between tribal territory and settler lands, and the circumstances were disputed by both sides. The soldiers claimed they had been fired upon without provocation and had responded in self-defense. The tribal hunting party maintained that the soldiers had attacked first, apparently believing the warriors were planning to raid nearby settlements. Gray Wolf had been shot while trying to escape the confrontation, and his death inflamed tensions throughout the region. Soaring Hawk demanded immediate retaliation against the soldiers and their commander, calling for a war party to strike back against the settlement that had dispatched the patrol. He argued that his brother's peace initiative had made the tribe appear weak, encouraging the soldiers to act with impunity against tribal members. Chief Standing Wolf found himself in the most difficult position of his long leadership career. His brother's arguments carried weight with many tribal members who had already been skeptical of the peace process. The death of a young warrior, particularly one from Soaring Hawk's family, could not be ignored or dismissed without undermining his authority as chief. At the same time, Wolf understood that any retaliatory attack would destroy the fragile progress that had been made in building relationships with moderate settlers like Thomas McKenna. The peace initiative would collapse, and the territory would likely descend into the kind of open warfare that would ultimately prove disastrous for both communities. Thomas learned about Gray Wolf's death through Pete, who had heard the news during a supply trip to the nearest town. The ranch hand was clearly shaken by the implications of the incident, and his report included warnings from townspeople about potential tribal retaliation. "Boss, maybe it's time to think about pulling back from this peace business," Pete suggested as they discussed the situation. "People in town are saying the tribes are planning to hit back hard for this killing, and they're worried that anyone connected to Chief Standing Wolf might be a target." Thomas spent a sleepless night considering his options. He could distance himself from Chief Standing Wolf and the peace initiative, potentially saving his ranch and his employees from becoming caught in the crossfire of renewed hostilities. Most of his neighbors would probably applaud such a decision, and he might even be able to rebuild his standing in the settler community. Alternatively, he could maintain his commitment to the peace process, despite the obvious risks to himself and his property. This path might cost him everything he had built in Montana, but it offered the only hope of preventing a war that would ultimately destroy far more than one ranch. As dawn broke over the rangeland, Thomas made his decision. He would ride to the twin brothers' rock formation and leave a message for Chief Standing Wolf, requesting an emergency meeting to discuss how they might prevent the crisis from escalating into open warfare. It was a dangerous gamble that might cost him his life, but it was also the only action consistent with the principles that had guided his rescue of Running Bear. The journey to the twin brothers took most of the morning, and Thomas used the time to carefully consider what he might say to Chief Standing Wolf that could make a difference in the current crisis. He understood that his position as an outsider to both communities might actually be an advantage, allowing him to propose solutions that neither side could suggest without appearing to compromise their own interests. When Thomas reached the distinctive rock formation, he tied a blue cloth to a piece of paper containing his request for a meeting and secured it at the base of the northern spire. The message was simple and direct. "My friend, dark times have come to test the bond between us. We must speak before the storm breaks completely. I will wait at the place where you first found hope in the heart of a white man." The place where you first found hope was Thomas's way of referring to the boulder where he had rescued Running Bear, a location that held special significance for Chief Standing Wolf and his family. By suggesting that meeting place, Thomas hoped to remind the chief of the positive possibilities that could emerge even from the darkest circumstances. Thomas returned to his ranch to wait, uncertain whether his message would even reach Chief Standing Wolf in time to make a difference. The territorial militia was reportedly mobilizing additional patrols in response to the threat of tribal retaliation, and there were rumors that the territorial governor might call in federal troops to prevent a larger conflict. 2 days later, as Thomas was checking his cattle in the north pasture, he spotted a lone rider approaching across the rangeland. As the figure drew closer, he recognized Running Bear, riding hard and looking around nervously as if he feared pursuit. The young warrior pulled up near Thomas and dismounted quickly. "My father sends word that he will meet with you at sunset tomorrow at the place you specified," Running Bear said, his English now much improved through months of practice. "But you must understand the danger you face by continuing to associate with our people. There are those among your settlers who would harm you for this loyalty to our friendship." Thomas nodded grimly. "I understand the risks, but some things are more important than personal safety. How is your father handling the pressure from those who want war?" Running Bear's expression grew troubled. "My uncle Soaring Hawk grows stronger each day in his demands for revenge. Many of the young warriors have begun painting themselves for battle, and the war songs can be heard in our camp every evening. My father holds him back through the strength of his leadership, but I do not know how much longer even he can control the anger of our people. The conversation continued for several minutes, with Running Bear providing details about the deteriorating situation within the tribal community. The death of Grey Wolf had crystallized all the frustrations and grievances that had been building up during months of continued harassment by territorial authorities. Even tribal members who had supported the peace initiative were beginning to question whether cooperation with whites was possible or desirable. As Running Bear prepared to depart, he delivered a final warning that chilled Thomas to the bone. There are reports that Silas Blackwood has convinced the territorial governor to issue orders for the arrest of any settler found to be in communication with tribal leaders. They claim such contacts constitute aid to enemy forces during a time of potential war. You could be charged with treason if you were discovered meeting with my father. Thomas felt the ground shifting beneath his feet as he realized how completely the situation had deteriorated. The peace initiative that had begun with such hope and promise was now being viewed by authorities as evidence of seditious activity. His decision to maintain contact with Chief Standing Wolf might not just cost him his ranch. It might cost him his freedom or even his life. That evening, as Thomas sat on his porch watching the sun set over the western mountains, he reflected on the strange journey that had brought him to this crossroads. Less than a year ago, he had been a simple rancher concerned primarily with the daily challenges of managing cattle and surviving the harsh frontier environment. Now he found himself at the center of a crisis that might determine the future of relations between two entire peoples. Miguel approached from the barn, his weathered face creased with concern. The older man had been with Thomas long enough to read his moods accurately, and he could see the weight of difficult decisions in his employer's bearing. "Pete, and I've been talking, boss," Miguel said quietly. "We know you're planning something that might be dangerous, and we want you to know that we'll stand by you whatever you decide. You saved our jobs when nobody else would hire Mexican workers, and we don't forget loyalty like that." Thomas was moved by this expression of support from men who had every reason to distance themselves from his increasingly controversial activities. "I appreciate that more than you know, Miguel, but I want both of you to understand that things might get very dangerous in the next few days. If you want to leave until this crisis passes, I'll understand completely." Miguel shook his head firmly. "We've been through bad times before, and we've always faced them together. Whatever trouble comes, we'll meet it as a team." The next day passed with agonizing slowness as Thomas tried to maintain his normal routine while preparing for what might be the most important conversation of his life. He spent extra time caring for his animals and equipment, knowing that if the meeting with Chief Standing Wolf went badly, it might be a long time before he had the opportunity to return to his ranch. As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, Thomas saddled his horse and set out for the boulder where he had first encountered Running Bear. The ride gave him additional time to organize his thoughts and prepare for what he hoped would be a productive discussion about preventing the looming war. When Thomas arrived at the meeting place, he found Chief Standing Wolf already waiting, accompanied only by Running Bear. The chief appeared to have aged significantly in the months since their last meeting, with new lines of worry etched around his eyes and a weariness in his bearing that spoke of sleepless nights and difficult decisions. "My friend," Wolf greeted Thomas as he dismounted, "I come to you in the darkest hour our peoples have faced since the first white men arrived in this territory. The voices calling for war grow louder each day, and I fear that even my authority as chief may not be enough to prevent the storm that is gathering." Thomas approached the older man with the respect and warmth that had characterized their relationship from the beginning. "Then we must find a way to give those voices something else to consider. War will destroy everything we have worked to build, but it will also destroy much more than that. The question is whether we can offer an alternative that satisfies the legitimate grievances on both sides." The three men spent the next hour in intense discussion, exploring options that might defuse the crisis without either side losing face or abandoning their principles. Chief Standing Wolf explained in detail the political pressures he was facing from within his own tribe, while Thomas described the growing hostility he had encountered from territorial authorities and neighboring settlers. Running Bear contributed his own perspective as someone who had experienced both the benefits of peaceful cooperation and the reality of continued tensions between the communities. His analysis was particularly valuable because he understood the viewpoints of the younger warriors who were most eager for retaliation. As darkness began to fall across the landscape, the outline of a potential solution began to emerge from their discussions. It was a risky plan that would require courage and sacrifice from leaders in both communities, but it offered the only realistic hope of preventing the war that seemed increasingly inevitable. The plan centered on a bold gesture that would demonstrate the possibility of justice without resorting to violence, while also addressing the legitimate grievances that were driving both sides toward conflict. Its success would depend on the willingness of moderate voices in both communities to take enormous personal risks for the sake of a larger peace. As Thomas prepared to return to his ranch that night, he carried with him not only the details of their ambitious plan, but also a renewed sense of purpose and hope. The next few weeks would test everything he believed about the power of compassion to overcome hatred, but he was no longer facing that test alone. The plan that emerged from Thomas's desperate meeting with Chief Standing Wolf was audacious in its simplicity and dangerous in its execution. Both men understood that traditional approaches to resolving conflicts between their peoples had repeatedly failed because they relied on negotiations between official representatives who often had little real understanding of each other's perspectives or constraints. Instead, they proposed to address the crisis through a demonstration of mutual accountability that would transcend the usual political maneuvering and speak directly to the fundamental human desire for justice. The plan required Chief Standing Wolf to take an unprecedented step that would risk his authority within his own tribe, while Thomas would need to make a sacrifice that could cost him everything he had built in Montana. The death of Gray Wolf had occurred during what both sides now acknowledged was a tragic misunderstanding escalated by fear and mutual suspicion. The territorial soldiers had genuinely believed they were preventing an attack on nearby settlements, while the tribal hunting party had been pursuing game in an area they considered to be within their traditional hunting grounds. The confrontation had erupted when nervous soldiers misinterpreted the movements of equally nervous warriors, leading to the unnecessary death of a young man whose only crime was being in the wrong place at the wrong time. Chief Standing Wolf's contribution to the peace plan was to voluntarily surrender himself to territorial authorities for trial, despite having had no direct involvement in the incident that led to Gray Wolf's death. This gesture would demonstrate his commitment to seeking justice through legal processes rather than violence, while also providing a face-saving way for territorial officials to show their willingness to pursue peaceful solutions. Thomas's role was equally risky and potentially costly. He would publicly advocate for Chief Standing Wolf's innocence and fair treatment, using his position as a respected member of the settler community to challenge the anti-tribal sentiment that had been inflamed by recent events. More significantly, he would offer his own ranch as surety for Wolf's good faith, meaning that if the chief fled or if his people launched retaliatory attacks, Thomas would forfeit his property to compensate the territorial government. The plan was fraught with obvious dangers for both men. Chief Standing Wolf would be placing himself at the mercy of a legal system that had historically shown little consideration for Native American rights or perspectives. Even if he received a fair trial, the political pressure for conviction might prove overwhelming regardless of the evidence. Thomas faced equally serious risks. His public support for Chief Standing Wolf would likely complete his transformation from respected rancher to suspected traitor in the eyes of many settlers. Silas Blackwood and his allies would undoubtedly use Thomas's actions as evidence that he had been corrupted by tribal influence and could no longer be trusted to represent settler interests. Despite these dangers, both men recognized that their plan offered the only realistic alternative to a war that would ultimately destroy far more than their personal fortunes or reputations. The territory was balanced on the edge of a conflict that could spread throughout the region, drawing in federal troops and potentially leading to the kind of systematic violence that had characterized other frontier wars. The first step in implementing their plan required Chief Standing Wolf to convince his own people, particularly his brother Soaring Hawk, that voluntary surrender represented strength rather than weakness. This proved to be one of the most challenging aspects of the entire endeavor, as it required overturning generations of tribal tradition that viewed capture by enemies as the ultimate dishonor. Running Bear played a crucial role in building support for his father's decision within the tribal council. He argued passionately that the chief's willingness to face white man's justice demonstrated the same courage that warriors showed in battle, while also proving that their people were committed to finding peaceful solutions to disputes. The young warrior also emphasized the practical benefits of the plan, pointing out that Chief Standing Wolf's trial would focus public attention on the circumstances surrounding Gray Wolf's death and might lead to reforms in how territorial authorities dealt with tribal peoples. Even if the trial ended badly for the chief, it would serve as powerful evidence that legal processes could not be trusted to deliver justice, potentially justifying stronger responses in the future. Gradually, through a combination of political skill, moral authority, and practical arguments, Chief Standing Wolf succeeded in gaining tribal council approval for his plan. Even Soaring Hawk eventually agreed to support his brother's decision, though he made it clear that any mistreatment of the chief during his captivity would be met with immediate and overwhelming retaliation. Thomas faced his own challenges in preparing for his role in the plan. He needed to build support among moderate settlers while also ensuring that his public advocacy for Chief Standing Wolf would be seen as principled rather than naive. This required careful timing and a thorough understanding of the political dynamics within the settler community. Miguel and Pete proved to be invaluable allies in this effort. Both men had lived on the frontier long enough to understand the difference between necessary caution and irrational hatred, and they used their connections within the Mexican and working-class communities to build broader support for peaceful solutions to the current crisis. The breakthrough came when Thomas succeeded in recruiting the support of Father Martinez, a Catholic priest who served the spiritual needs of both Mexican settlers and some tribal members who had converted to Christianity. Father Martinez had been deeply troubled by the escalating tensions and was willing to use his moral authority to advocate for justice and peaceful resolution. With careful preparation complete, Chief Standing Wolf surrendered himself to territorial authorities on a crisp autumn morning that would be remembered throughout the region for generations to come. The chief rode alone into the territorial capital, wearing his finest ceremonial clothing and carrying no weapons except for a peace pipe that had been used by his father and grandfather in previous negotiations with white officials. Thomas accompanied the chief as his self-appointed advocate and interpreter, a role that immediately drew criticism from territorial officials who questioned whether a settler could adequately represent tribal interests. Thomas responded by producing documents establishing his credentials as a property owner and respected member of the community, while also presenting the signed agreement, making his ranch security for Chief Standing Wolf's good faith. The trial that followed became a sensation throughout the Montana Territory and beyond, with newspaper reporters traveling from distant cities to cover what many described as an unprecedented test of frontier justice. The territorial government found itself under intense scrutiny from federal officials and Eastern newspapers that had been following the story of the peace initiative and its dramatic culmination. Silas Blackwood and his allies worked tirelessly to ensure Chief Standing Wolf's conviction, arguing that the trial represented an opportunity to send a clear message about the consequences of tribal resistance to territorial authority. They brought witnesses who testified about previous incidents involving tribal members and painted a picture of Chief Standing Wolf as a dangerous leader whose peaceful overtures were simply camouflage for more sinister intentions. Thomas countered these attacks by presenting evidence of the chief's consistent efforts to prevent conflicts and honor agreements with territorial officials. He brought testimony from moderate settlers who had observed the positive results of the peace initiative, as well as military officers who acknowledged that Chief Standing Wolf's band had never been implicated in any raids or attacks against settler communities. The trial's most dramatic moment came when Running Bear was allowed to testify about his rescue by Thomas and the subsequent relationship that had developed between their families. The young warrior's account of his near-death experience and the compassion shown by a white stranger provided a powerful counterargument to claims that peaceful coexistence between the communities was impossible. Running Bear's testimony was delivered in halting but clear English, and his obvious sincerity made a strong impression on spectators and jury members alike. He concluded his statement by pointing to Thomas and declaring, "This man saved my life when he could have let me die. My father seeks to save many lives by trusting in white man's justice. We hope that trust will be honored as we have honored the friendship offered to us." The jury deliberated for 3 days while the entire territory held its breath, waiting to see whether the experiment in peaceful conflict resolution would succeed or fail. During this period, both settler and tribal communities remained remarkably calm, as if everyone understood that the verdict would determine not just Chief Standing Wolf's fate, but the future of relationships between their peoples. When the jury finally returned, their verdict reflected the complex realities of frontier justice and the power of personal testimony to overcome political prejudice. Chief Standing Wolf was acquitted of any wrongdoing related to Gray Wolf's death, but the jury also issued a statement calling for reforms in how territorial authorities handled interactions with tribal peoples. The verdict represented a compromise that allowed both sides to claim victory while avoiding the devastating consequences of continued escalation. Chief Standing Wolf had proven that justice could be achieved through legal processes rather than violence, while territorial officials had demonstrated their willingness to apply the law fairly regardless of racial considerations. More importantly, the trial had created a new framework for resolving future disputes between settler and tribal communities. The precedent of voluntary surrender and fair trial provided an alternative to the cycle of retaliation that had previously characterized frontier conflicts. Thomas's role in achieving this outcome made him a controversial figure throughout the territory, with supporters hailing him as a visionary peacemaker, while critics continued to view him as a traitor to his own people. However, the practical success of his approach gradually won over even some of his harshest opponents, as the reduction in violence benefited everyone regardless of their political views. The years that followed saw a gradual expansion of the cooperative relationship between Thomas's ranch and Chief Standing Wolf's band. The seasonal gatherings that had begun as desperate attempts to prevent war evolved into regular events that brought together families from both communities for trade, celebration, and mutual assistance. Running Bear became a frequent visitor to the ranch, eventually serving as an informal liaison between the communities and helping to resolve minor disputes before they could escalate into major conflicts. His fluency in English and his deep understanding of both cultures made him an invaluable resource for maintaining the peace that had been so carefully constructed. Thomas never married again, but he found fulfillment in the surrogate family that developed around his relationship with Chief Standing Wolf and his people. The loneliness that had defined his life after Sarah's death was replaced by a sense of purpose and belonging that transcended the conventional boundaries of frontier society. As Thomas aged, he became increasingly recognized as one of the founding fathers of peaceful coexistence in the Montana Territory. Visitors from other regions came to study the successful model of cooperation he had helped to create, and his ranch became a symbol of what could be achieved when people chose compassion over fear. Chief Standing Wolf lived to see his great-grandchildren playing with the children of settlers whose parents had once viewed tribal members as mortal enemies. The peace he had risked everything to achieve became so deeply embedded in the culture of the region that future generations would find it difficult to believe that their communities had once been at war. The silver medallion that Wolf had given to Thomas became a family heirloom passed down through the generations of both communities. Its story was told and retold as a reminder that individual acts of kindness could have consequences far beyond anything their authors might imagine. When Thomas McKenna died peacefully at his ranch in 1903, Chief Standing Wolf, despite his own advanced age, insisted on attending the funeral. The sight of the elderly tribal leader paying his respects to the white rancher who had saved his son and helped to save his people provided a fitting conclusion to a remarkable story of friendship and mutual respect. The funeral was attended by hundreds of people from both communities, representing 3 generations of families who had benefited from the peace that began with one man's decision to offer water to a dying stranger. The speakers included territorial officials, tribal elders, Mexican workers, and frontier families who had all played roles in building and maintaining the cooperative relationship that had become the foundation of regional prosperity. Running Bear, now a respected elder himself, delivered the final eulogy for the man who had saved his life and changed the course of history through a simple act of compassion. His words captured the essence of Thomas's legacy and the lasting significance of choosing humanity over hostility in even the most difficult circumstances. This man taught us that enemies become brothers when one heart reaches out to another in need, Running Bear concluded. He showed us that the strongest medicine against hatred is the recognition that we are all part of the same human family. The water he gave to a dying warrior became a river of peace that will flow through these lands for all the generations to come. The story of Thomas McKenna and Chief Standing Wolf became one of the most celebrated examples of successful conflict resolution in the history of the American West. Their approach to building peace through personal relationships and mutual accountability was studied and replicated in other regions where similar tensions existed between different communities. More than a century later, their legacy continues to inspire people who face seemingly insurmountable divisions in their own societies.